It is sometime in the 12th century. The world feels smaller than it truly is, and yet to those who lived then, it must have felt impossibly wide. Across the towns and manors of Europe, justice is not the silent weighing of evidence or the delicate turning of laws written on parchment. It is something older, stranger, and more tactile. Something you can see, touch, and occasionally taste. You might imagine a medieval trial involving knights and kings, stern judges in long robes, and juries listening to testimony. But more often, justice came in humbler, more peculiar forms. In a village square in the Rhineland, or perhaps in a Norman hamlet, a man accused of theft might be handed a piece of cheese, not to eat for comfort or reward, but to prove his innocence. This was known, quite literally, as a trial by cheese. Cheese as a witness, the idea sounds absurd to modern ears, but in the Middle Ages, the boundaries between the natural, the divine, and the human were porous. Everything was evidence of God's will. A disease, a drought, or even the stiffness of a man's tongue could be taken as a sign of guilt. The cheese test, or coarsen meaning trial morsel, was one of several so-called ordeals, physical tests believed to reveal divine judgment. In England, the coarsened was used in the 10th and 11th centuries, and sometimes even later, when written law was scarce and witnesses were few. The accused, often someone of notable rank, would be made to take a small piece of consecrated bread or cheese, blessed by a priest. Then they would eat it before the assembled community. If the person could swallow it easily, God had declared them innocent. If they choked, coughed, or turned pale, it was a sign of guilt. Heaven's verdict rendered through the throat. The cheese was not ordinary food. It was sanctified, sometimes mixed with bits of scripture or holy salt. The ceremony was solemn, almost liturgical. The priest might recite Psalm 7a, "Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness." The crowd would watch in silence, listening to the sound of chewing. There are no surviving records of exactly how many people passed or failed such a trial. But even the fact that it existed, that people believed the body could not deceive God, reveals something essential about medieval thinking. It was a world without our clear distinctions between science, faith, and superstition. Everything was part of one continuous moral order. The origins of the edible ordeal, the coarsened, may have older, pagan roots. Anthropologists have long noted the similarity to oath rituals found among early Germanic tribes, where a man swore truth over sacred food or drink, bread or salt. Breaking that oath was believed to curse his body from within. Christianity, arriving later, reshaped these traditions rather than erasing them. By the 12th century, such practices were already fading, replaced slowly by written law codes and the growth of ecclesiastical courts. Yet the habit of looking to food, to the earth itself, for judgment lingered. The coarsened remained in memory in legend and in legal commentary. One famous tale tells of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, a powerful noble who died in 1053 after protesting his innocence to King Edward the Confessor. According to chroniclers, Godwin declared, "May this morsel choke me if I am guilty," and then immediately fell dead after swallowing it. To later writers, it was divine confirmation. To us, it may sound like a tragic coincidence, or perhaps a choking accident, misread by a fearful court. Either way, the idea that the body could not hide sin was central to medieval law. The law of the Bodhi, the ordeal of cheese, was part of a broader system of trial by ordeal, which included boiling water, burning irons, and cold baths. A person accused of theft might have to retrieve a stone from a pot of boiling water. A woman accused of witchcraft might be cast into a pond to see if she floated. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was believed to be divine arbitration. Cheese was, in a way, the most merciful of ordeals. It did not scar the flesh or drown the lungs. Instead, it tested the honesty of the soul through one's ability to eat calmly under divine scrutiny. A priest presided, witnesses watched, and everyone waited for the smallest cough. What made it law was not the act itself, but the community's agreement that the result was final. To fail the coarsened was to stand outside God's protection, stripped of legal rights. To pass it was to be restored, not just to society but to the church's embrace. Justice, in this sense, was a kind of ritual purification. Cheese as symbol food held symbolic power in medieval life. Bread represented the body of Christ, wine the blood, and cheese, produced through the mysterious alchemy of milk, rennet, and thyme, carried its own associations. It was the food of monks and peasants alike, simple but sustaining. To eat cheese before the altar was to submit to God's scrutiny through a humble, everyday object. Monks who kept meticulous records of their diets often wrote about cheese in ways that bordered on theological reflection. The rule of St. Benedict advised moderation in all foods. but cheese was common in the refectories of European monasteries. The monks who made it followed detailed routines: curdling, pressing, salting, aging, a quiet rhythm that echoed their prayers. Perhaps this reverence made it suitable for judgment. There was also a practical side. Cheese, when consecrated, could last longer than bread. It traveled well, did not mold as easily, and could be blessed and stored for later rituals. In an age when parchment was scarce and oral oaths were everything, such durability mattered. Cheese, quite literally, preserved truth. The quiet law of the parish in many ways, the coarsened represents the local nature of medieval law. Justice was not centralized. Every parish, manor, and village had its own customs. Some used water ordeals, others hot iron, and others, perhaps only once or twice a year, the sacred cheese. The law was something people could see and participate in. There were no distant courts or impersonal bureaucracies. The trial was held in the open, before the eyes of the neighbors. Everyone had a role: the priest to bless, the accused to eat, the witnesses to watch. The outcome was binding because all had seen it. You can almost imagine the scene: a small wooden church, a rough-hewn table, a piece of cheese on a pewter plate. A man stands trembling, his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the priest's gesture. The cheese is blessed, lifted, and given. Silence, a swallow, a breath, then either relief or fear. For those who watched, the moment confirmed their world's order. Justice had been done, not by human reasoning but by the mysterious will of God. There would be no appeal. The decline of the edible ordeal, the coarsened, began to fade in the 13th century, especially after Pope Innocent III condemned trial by ordeal at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The Church declared that God's will should not be tested by physical means. From then on, rational evidence, witnesses, documents, began to take precedence. Still, the memory lingered. Even centuries later, English antiquarians wrote about the curse, bite, and its strange mixture of piety and fear. Some rural communities continued to use food in oath rituals well into the 1500s, though more as folklore than law. In time, trials moved from churches to courts, from open fields to stone halls. Judges replaced priests, lawyers replaced witnesses, parchment replaced cheese. But something of that old belief, that guilt can reveal itself through the body, never quite disappeared. Even today, the trembling hands of the accused, the dry throat, the swallowed hesitation, these are still, in a sense, remnants of the old trial by cheese. A world measured by faith, the coursen is just one example of how law, faith, and daily life intertwined in medieval Europe. It was not a primitive superstition but a reflection of how people made sense of justice in a world without science. To them, God's judgment was not abstract, it was tangible, edible, real, and perhaps in its own strange way it worked. The fear of divine punishment kept oaths sacred. The ritual gave closure where evidence could not. For a society built on trust and proximity, where most people never traveled beyond their village, that mattered more than logic. If you lived then, you might not find the trial by cheese absurd. You might see it as reassuring, a visible sign that truth, however hidden, would always come to light. And yet, one wonders, when the last priest placed the final piece of sanctified cheese on a trembling tongue, and when the church itself declared the practice obsolete, what replaced that silence? What did justice feel like when God stopped speaking through food? The coarsened, as strange as it may sound to you now, was only one fragment of a much broader system that governed medieval Europe. A system that blended belief, ritual, and survival. To understand how cheese could be used to decide guilt, one must look beyond the ritual itself and into the structure of the society that created it. After all, law was not simply written on parchment. It was lived, spoken, remembered, and performed. And every village had its own small theatre of justice. From ordeal to oath, by the 12th century, European law was in a slow process of change, though few living then would have noticed it. In rural parishes where literacy was rare and parchment expensive, law was oral. It existed in memory, in custom, in the words people repeated. But in monasteries, towns, and courts tied to growing monarchies, something was stirring. Record-keeping clerks began to write, not just charters and taxes, but names, disputes, verdicts. The written word was creeping into justice, and with it came a subtle shift in what people believed proof meant. Once, God's direct intervention had been enough. Now, the idea that evidence could be gathered, that facts could be weighed, began to take root. The coarsened belonged to the older world, where proof came from heaven. But in the growing world of kings, merchants, and clerks, proof began to come from men. This change did not happen overnight. In many villages, both worlds existed side by side. Priests still blessed cheese while sheriffs took written confessions. The divine and the bureaucratic overlapped awkwardly, like two languages half understood. In 1215, when the Lateran Council banned ordeal trials, the Church did not simply abolish old customs, it redefined what truth meant. Instead of waiting for God to act through water, fire, or cheese, priests and judges would now act through reason, testimony, and penance. Guilt became something to be proven, not revealed. For centuries, people had looked for truth in miracles. Now, they had to find it in men's words. The rise of the jury. One of the most remarkable developments of this shift was the jury. Today, the jury seems like a cornerstone of justice, impartial citizens weighing evidence, but its roots were far less formal. In early medieval England and Normandy, juries began as groups of local men sworn to speak truth about what they already knew. They were not neutral observers. They were the community itself. Instead of divine judgment, the king's court would summon 12 men from the neighborhood. Their task was to say under oath whether they believed the accused guilty. The assumption was that in small villages, everyone already knew, or thought they knew, who stole the ox, who broke the fence, who lied. Justice depended not on revelation, but on reputation. It was, in its way, an evolution of the same communal logic that had sustained the coarsened. The difference was that now, truth emerged from collective human memory rather than divine intervention. The ritual of eating sacred cheese gave way to the ritual of swearing an oath. Both were solemn, both binding. Both relied on fear of sin, of perjury, of eternal consequence. The law had become more bureaucratic, but no less sacred. The role of the Church's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. For centuries, it had presided over ordeals, blessing the cheese, the water, the iron. After 1215, it withdrew, forcing secular courts to find new methods. But the Church did not abandon justice. It reshaped it. Confession replaced ordeal as the spiritual test of truth. Instead of waiting for a choking throat to reveal guilt, priests now encouraged sinners to confess voluntarily. Penance became the new judgment, and sin a matter of inward reflection rather than public spectacle. God's will, once displayed in the open, moved into the private heart. This shift mirrored broader changes in European thought. The 13th century saw the rise of scholasticism, a movement centered on logic, debate, and reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas argued that faith and reason could coexist. In the same way, law began to blend the divine with the rational. It became a field of study, not just an act of ritual. Still, the memory of the old ordeals lingered, especially in rural communities. People continued to believe in signs and symbols, in milk that curdled when a witch passed by, or in bread that revealed falsehoods. These beliefs were not so easily replaced by written law. They endured because they were tangible, immediate, and local. They were laws you could see. Cheese, measure, and market. Cheese also lived on in another, quieter form of law, the regulation of food and trade. As markets expanded across medieval Europe, authorities began to measure and standardize goods. Weights, prices, and purity became matters of civic order. Food was no longer only a spiritual symbol, it was an economic concern. In England, the assize of bread and ale, first established in 1266, became one of the most important laws of daily life. It regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread and beer. And by extension, cheese and butter. Bakers and brewers could be punished for overcharging or underweight loaves. Inspectors, known as olatastas, and bread weighers, walked through markets checking scales. The same principle that had governed the coarsened, that food could reveal moral truth, now governed the market. If your bread was too light, you were dishonest. If your cheese was adulterated, you were corrupt. Justice had moved from the altar to the marketplace, but the symbolism remained the same. Purity of food reflected purity of soul. Even guilds adopted this language. Cheesemakers' guilds in Flanders and France swore oaths to uphold honest measures. Their rules were recorded with almost religious precision. The size of curds, the amount of salt, the hours of aging. Failure to follow these rules was not just bad business. It was a kind of sin against the order of things. In these quiet ordinances, one can trace the fading echo of the trial by cheese. What had once been divine judgment was now civic regulation, but beneath the bureaucracy, the belief endured that fairness could be tasted, weighed, and seen. The weight of paper. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Europe was covered in parchment. Manorial rolls, tax lists, guild charters, court proceedings. Every act of law was being written down. The scribe, not the priest, had become the new mediator between heaven and earth. Ink replaced blessing. Signatures replaced prayers. This transformation was both liberating and alienating. Written law allowed justice to travel, to be consistent across shires and kingdoms. But it also created distance. Where once the accused had faced his neighbors in the churchyard, now he faced a clerk behind a table, scratching with a quill. Justice became slower, colder, less visible. Still, the remnants of the old ordeals lingered in language. Legal phrases like, "the proof lies upon him," or "let the accused clear himself," carried echoes of a time when proof was literal, physical, even edible. The concept of being caught red-handed comes from older ritual tests involving fire and water. To swallow your words recalls the choking guilt of the coarsened. Law remembers in metaphors what it forgets in practice. And so the medieval world drifted, gradually from judgment by miracle to judgment by evidence, from cheese to paper. But it did so uneasily, as though uncertain whether the written word could truly replace divine will. The memory of Godwin in the centuries that followed. The legend of Earl Godwin's fatal mouthful endured as a cautionary tale. Chroniclers retold it in monasteries and courts alike. For some, it was a story of divine justice, proof that God still spoke through the body. For others, it was a relic of darker times, before the light of reason. The chronicler William of Malmesbury wrote that Godwin's death was no accident, but a judgment of the Lord. Later historians, writing in the calm Latin of universities, debated whether the tale was apocryphal. But the image, a powerful man struck down by a mouthful of bread, persisted in imagination. It encapsulated an age when guilt could choke you, when truth was not argued but revealed. Even centuries later, in English folk sayings, the fear of the cursed bite survived. To this day, phrases like "bitter mouthful" or "choked on his lies" carry faint echoes of that belief. Language remembers what reason forgets. Law, fear, and faith. To live under medieval law was to live under constant watch, not only of kings and sheriffs, but of God. The smallest act carried moral weight. Selling watered oil, cheating on measures, lying under oath. These were not just crimes but sins. The church bell and the market bell rang from the same tower, and yet, despite its severity, medieval law had an intimate human quality. It was rooted in community. Punishments were public, yes, but so were reconciliations. A thief might be made to confess before the parish, to apologize, to return what was stolen. Justice was not a separate sphere, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. This intimacy, this sense that law was something lived rather than imposed, may be what we have lost. Today, justice is abstract, hidden in codes and contracts. Then, it was embodied. In bread, in cheese, in flesh. You could feel it, taste it, fear it. The quiet disappearance. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the trial by cheese was a faint memory. Scholars dismissed it as superstition. Jurists ignored it. The church, once its guardian, now turned to canon law. The new Europe, with its merchants, scholars, and centralized courts, had little room for edible justice. And yet, in some corners the old ways persisted. In isolated alpine valleys and rural parishes, fragments of food-based oath rituals survived into the 16th and 17th centuries. Peasants swore honesty over shared loaves or exchanged salted cheese as a pledge of peace. These were no longer trials, but traditions, echoes of a time when food and faith were one. The coarsened had vanished from law, but not from imagination. It lingered in stories, in idioms, in the quiet superstition that sometimes the truth is still a matter of the throat, of what can or cannot be swallowed. And so, as the parchment replaced the priest, and the ledger replaced the altar, Europe's sense of justice changed. It grew more rational, yes, but also more distant. The cheese that once held the power to reveal divine truth became just a food again, a product to be weighed and sold. But perhaps that transformation raises a quieter question. When truth ceased to be visible, when it stopped living in things and began living only in words, did justice become clearer, or merely harder to taste? By the 15th century, few remembered the coarsened as anything more than a curiosity. The age of edible judgment had passed, buried beneath centuries of parchment and ink. Yet even as it faded from memory, it left behind a kind of quiet echo, a trace of the medieval belief that truth could live inside the body. This echo lingered not in cathedrals or law courts, but in the ordinary corners of daily life, in taverns, kitchens, and monasteries. And it lingered most clearly in the strange and patient world of food itself, the realm that once bound heaven and earth together through rituals of taste and trust. Cheese in the cloister. If you were to walk through a Benedictine monastery in the late Middle Ages, you might still smell cheese aging in the cool stone cellars. Wheels stacked on wooden planks, tended by novices in silence. Cheese was part of the monastic rhythm, curdled after matins, salted after lauds, turned after vespers. It was humble, steady work, the kind of work that kept the world running. Monks were some of the finest cheesemakers in Europe. In regions like Burgundy, Flanders, and the Swiss Alps, monasteries developed recipes that would later become famous, though their fame was never the monks' goal. Their cheeses were made for pilgrims, for travelers, for the poor at the gate. Each wheel was both food and offering. To the monks, cheese symbolized patience and transformation. It took time to become itself. Milk soured, curdled and aged. The process was quiet, slow, and unseen, like prayer. And so it is not surprising that for centuries they believed it could reveal truth. What other food changed so gently or lasted so long? Even after the coarsened had vanished from law, some monasteries continued to bless food during disputes, asking God to make the guilty choke. It was no longer an official ordeal, more a fragment of habit, a prayer half remembered. The priest might murmur, "May this food be pure," and the eater likewise. The community would nod, comforted by the gesture, if not by the theology. The cheese, once a tool of justice, had become a relic of conscience. From faith to science, as Europe entered the Renaissance, the world began to look less miraculous and more measurable. Scholars rediscovered Aristotle and Euclid. Physicians studied anatomy, not miracles. The heavens were charted, not prayed to. Truth was no longer revealed by divine signs, but discovered through observation. Law, too, began to change again. Judges trained in universities, not monasteries. Evidence meant documents, not omens. Yet even as the world grew more rational, the human longing for signs did not disappear. People still sought patterns in coincidence, justice in fate, meaning in accidents. When a guilty man choked during a meal, it still felt like judgment. Cheese, by contrast, became simply food, an object of trade, of craft, of taste. The monks' cheeses evolved into local specialties: Comté, Gruyère, Stilton, Roquefort. No one thought of them as instruments of divine truth anymore. They were measured by weight and sold by price. But the same patience, the same transformation, still defined them. It is easy to forget that many of the things we consider ordinary once held sacred power. The coarsened reminds us that even the dullest materials, a crust of bread, a wedge of cheese, once stood at the center of belief. The boundary between faith and food, between justice and digestion, was never clear. Justice in the village outside the cloisters, the village courts of Europe continued to evolve. Manor courts still met under oak trees or in church porches, but their business was now recorded on parchment. The bailiff called names, the clerk wrote them down, the steward presided. The community gathered, just as before, to witness judgment. If you were accused of theft in such a court, you would no longer be handed cheese or asked to touch iron. Instead, you would be questioned. Neighbors would testify. The steward would weigh their words. It was in its way still an ordeal, a test of memory, character, and reputation. But the language had changed. What had once been divine revelation was now civic procedure. Yet beneath the new form, the old instincts endured. People still looked for signs of guilt, the trembling hand, the hesitant answer, the sweat on the brow. They still believed the body told the truth. Only now, instead of calling it divine judgment, they called it demeanor. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the coarsened, the belief that truth lives in the body, that the flesh remembers what the mind hides. Even in modern trials, we speak of body language, of tells, of gut feeling. The ritual is gone, but the instinct remains. The persistence of ritual. Every legal system, no matter how rational, has its rituals. The oath on the Bible, the raised right hand, the solemn words, all these are descendants of older, humbler gestures. They exist not because they change the facts, but because they help people feel that truth has weight. In that sense, the coarsened was not so different from what we still do today. The courtroom, with its robes and standing orders, is a kind of theatre. The act of swearing to tell the truth, of placing a hand on sacred text, of waiting for a verdict, all of it is ritualized. The difference is that we no longer expect God to intervene directly. But the need for ceremony remains. Without it, law feels hollow. And so, in a way, the medieval world was not mistaken, only literal. They believed God would make the guilty choke. We believe that evidence will make the guilty confess. Both are acts of faith in a system larger than ourselves. The cheese was never the point. The belief was. A curious afterlife. Though the trial by cheese faded, it did not vanish entirely from memory. Antiquarians of the 17th and 18th centuries rediscovered references to it in old law codes and chronicles. They found the word coarsened in glossaries and puzzled over its meaning. Some mocked it, others treated it as evidence of ancient piety. One scholar, writing in 1720, remarked that our ancestors did eat their justice as they did their bread. Another, less amused, called it a barbarous remnant of superstition. both missed the quiet dignity of the act. The coarsened was never barbarous. It was simply a world's attempt to make justice tangible. In Victorian England, the story of Earl Godwin's fatal mouthful reappeared in popular histories and sermons. Preachers used it as a warning against hypocrisy. May no man swallow a lie without choking on it. Schoolchildren learned it as a curiosity, a footnote to the age of Edward the Confessor. By then, the sacred cheese had become a metaphor, nothing more. And yet, in a few rural parishes, older villagers still remembered fragments of blessing over food, prayers to keep it honest. They did not know why such words existed, only that they had always been said. The coarsened had become invisible, surviving only as instinct. The modern reflection in our own time, surrounded by laws so complex that few could recite even a fraction of them, the trial by cheese feels quaint, almost comforting. Its simplicity is its strangeness. A man eats. If he swallows, he lives. If he cannot, he is guilty. It is absurd, yet it speaks to something universal, the yearning for justice to be visible, immediate, and human. We like to think our modern systems are rational, but they, too, depend on faith. Faith in evidence, in institutions, in the honesty of witnesses. The coarsened only made that faith visible. It gave form to what we still believe, that truth should manifest itself somehow, somewhere, even if no one understands how. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Beneath its strangeness lies a kind of innocence, a belief that justice is not beyond comprehension, that it can be touched, tasted, and known. Cheese as memory. There is one last way in which cheese preserves the memory of its sacred past through time. Each wheel of cheese is, in essence, a stored moment. Milk taken from cows months ago becomes something new, but not entirely transformed. It carries with it traces of the field, the season, the animal, a quiet record of life. So too did the coarsened hold the memory of a world that believed every object had meaning. To eat cheese before the altar was to consume the world's memory. The pasture, the herd, the hand that milked, the prayer that blessed. It was a reminder that justice, like food, came from the earth and returned to it. In that sense, the ritual was not just about guilt. It was about belonging, about placing oneself back into the order of things. The innocent man swallowed easily because he was in harmony with that order. The guilty could not, because he was not. The world itself rejected him. The silence that followed when the church finally abolished ordeals, it did not offer a replacement for their silence. The priest's blessing stopped, the congregation dispersed. Where once there had been a ritual that bound the community in awe, there was now only procedure. Written records replaced whispered prayers. The silence of the church was replaced by the scratching of pens. Perhaps that was progress, or perhaps it was merely change. Law became fairer, more consistent, less cruel, but it also became distant, abstract, and cold. The cheese that once sat between heaven and man had been removed, and with it, something of the warmth that made justice feel alive. Today, we still search for that warmth, in the oath, the ceremony, the final word of the judge. We still want justice to feel like something more than a line of text. We still want to see it happen. The coarsened gave people that. The sight of truth unfolding before their eyes, even if only through a swallow. And so, the strange law of medieval cheese fades into history, not as a joke, but as a mirror. It shows us how deeply human the search for fairness has always been. How even in the most ordinary things, a bite of food, a breath held too long, people once found meaning. It is easy to laugh at the coarsened, but perhaps harder to recognize in it our own need to believe that truth, somehow, will reveal itself. That, one day, justice will still be something you can taste. There are few things more ordinary than bread. It is the beginning of every meal, the center of every table, the quiet substance that ties together rich and poor alike. In medieval England, it was not merely food, it was life itself, and because it was life, it was law, the bread of the realm. If you lived in a town like Winchester, York, or London in the 13th century, you would have smelled the bakeries before you saw them. Narrow lanes filled with the scent of yeast, smoke, and hot stone. Bread was baked every day, sometimes twice a day, in hundreds of small ovens scattered through the neighborhoods. Most bakers worked in single-room shops, low ceilings, soot black walls, a single arched oven glowing like an ember. Flour dust clung to everything, to faces, aprons, even the door frames. The work began before dawn, when the city was still dark and silent. For most people, bread was the main food, the thing that stood between hunger and survival. Grain failures could cause famine. Dishonest baking could spark riots. The weight of a single loaf was, in a very literal sense, the weight of justice. That is why, in 1266, King Henry VIII's government issued one of the most detailed and enduring laws in medieval Europe, the Assize of Bread and Ale. The Assize, law by the ounce. The word assize simply means sitting, a formal session of law. But in this case, it referred to a set of fixed regulations determining how much a loaf of bread should weigh depending on the price of grain. If wheat was cheap, loaves were expected to be large. If wheat was expensive, they could be smaller. The price of the loaf was always the same, a farthing or a penny, but its size changed according to the market. The law included precise tables, measuring the relationship between wheat price and bread weight. For example, when a quarter of wheat cost 12 pence, the baker had to give 6 pounds and 16 ounces of bread for a penny. But if wheat rose to 20 pence, the loaf could shrink to 4 pounds and 5 ounces. Every ounce mattered. This may sound tedious, even absurdly bureaucratic, but in a society where famine was a constant threat, the stability of bread prices meant stability of life. The poor could not risk sudden rises in food costs. The assize of bread ensured that no baker, no matter how greedy, could exploit hunger. The baker's burden for the bakers themselves. The law was both a protection and a curse. They were required to follow the official table of assize, which changed whenever grain prices did, sometimes weekly. But most bakers were illiterate. They relied on word of mouth or on proclamations read aloud by town criers. If they guessed wrong, even by a few ounces, they could face severe punishment. Inspectors, known as alconers, or bread weighers, roamed the markets with scales. They would buy loaves from different bakers, weigh them, and compare them to the legal standard. A baker found cheating could be fined, whipped, or worse. The punishment known as the pillory. The pillory of bread. The pillory was a wooden structure with holes for the head and hands, set in the town square. A dishonest baker would be locked in it. His offending loaves hung around his neck as a sign of shame. Crowds gathered, jeering and throwing the stale bread back at him. The punishment was as public as it was humiliating, and yet it was common, so common that the phrase, baker's dozen, is said to have originated as a precaution. To avoid accidentally selling underweight loaves, bakers would give 13 instead of 12 when selling by the dozen, ensuring the buyer got their full weight. Bread, then, was not merely baked, it was measured. Every ounce was an act of law, every loaf a reflection of the crown's authority. The market as court markets were, in a sense, open-air courts. The weight of bread, the measure of all, the quality of butter. These were matters of legal concern, not private trade. Each town had officials responsible for ensuring fairness, the clerks of the market. They kept records, levied fines, and reported offenders. It was a remarkably bureaucratic system for its time. The assize of bread was enforced not by the king directly, but by local communities, an early form of delegated regulation. Towns took pride in their honesty. A well-run market was a moral as well as economic triumph. The rules extended beyond weight. Bakers were forbidden to mix inferior grains without disclosure, to use dirty water, or to bake on the Sabbath. Their ovens could even be inspected for cleanliness, though what passed for clean in the 13th century might still trouble modern sensibilities. Bread as status. Not all bread was the same. In medieval England, your social standing was visible in your loaf. The finest was manchet, made from white sifted flour, expensive, soft, and reserved for the wealthy. The middle class ate cocket, or wastel, brown but light, made from a mix of flours. The poor, meanwhile, survived on maslin, or horse bread, dark and coarse, often mixed with rye oats or even peas. The assize applied to all of these, but with different price standards. A penny's worth of wastel might weigh differently from a penny's worth of maslin. This fine-grained regulation reflects how deeply the medieval world was structured by hierarchy. Even bread was a measure of class. When famine struck, the poor were the first to feel it, their loaves shrinking until even a penny bought almost nothing. Bakers could not raise prices, so they reduced quality, mixing in bran or chaff. Inspectors sometimes punished them, but often turned a blind eye. After all, everyone was hungry. The baker's night. If you were a baker in 13th century England, your life was ruled by darkness and fire. Work began around midnight. The kneading troughs were filled by lamplight, the dough rising slowly in the cool air. Apprentices fetched water from wells and split firewood for the ovens. When the bells of matins sounded in the distant church, bakers were already shaping loaves, their hands moving rhythmically, almost unconsciously. By dawn, the first bread was ready. The smell filled the street. Children ran to the doorways, waiting for crumbs. Most bakers lived above or beside their shops, their families working alongside them. Flour was stored in wooden bins, yeast in small jars of fermented dough. There were no clocks, no timers, only instinct, experience, and the faint light of the sky. Each loaf that emerged from the oven was a small risk. If the bread weighed too little, the inspector could ruin them. If it weighed too much, they lost money. Every morning's work balanced between survival and punishment. When the loaf became political, bread was not only an economic necessity, it was political. Riots often began at the bakery door. When grain prices rose or harvests failed, the people looked first to the bakers, accusing them of hoarding flour, cheating weights, or conspiring with merchants. In times of scarcity, a baker's shop could become a battlefield. Records from London in the 1290s describe crowds smashing ovens, seizing loaves, and shouting "Death to the false bakers!" The mayor's guards had to intervene. Even when bakers were innocent, the appearance of unfairness was enough to spark anger. Bread symbolized justice itself. If a man could not afford a loaf, something was wrong with the kingdom. A world of measures, the obsession with measurement went beyond bread. Medieval England was a world of precise yet inconsistent units: bushels, gallons, stones, pounds, and marks. Towns often had their own standards. A Winchester bushel might differ from a London one by several ounces. Inspectors carried sets of approved weights made of bronze or lead, stamped with royal seals. The care with which these measures were guarded shows how fragile trust was in an age before industrial consistency. A dishonest scale could destroy confidence in an entire market. In this sense, the law of bread was also a law of faith, a way of ensuring that the invisible web of trust between baker, buyer, and crown did not tear. The moral weight of flour. The church, too, took an interest in bread. Priests preached that bakers had a moral duty to feed the hungry, not just a legal one. A dishonest loaf was a sin. Parish records show bakers donating bread to the poor as penance for minor offences, a small act of reparation that tied together morality and sustenance. Even the miracle of the Eucharist, where bread became the body of Christ, echoed through the daily work of the baker. To bake was to imitate creation, to turn the raw material of earth into nourishment. In that sense, every loaf carried spiritual meaning, even if baked only for sale. The end of the oven's monopoly. By the late 13th century, towns began to change. More households acquired small ovens, large communal bakehouses lost their monopoly. The assize of bread continued to exist, but enforcement grew uneven. In some regions, local lords or guilds took over the role of inspection. In others, it faded altogether. Still, the principle survived: food must be fair. Centuries later, the same idea would resurface in modern consumer protection laws. The insistence that every ounce, every measure, every sale be honest. And yet, one cannot help but imagine the baker at his oven, eyes tired, flour on his arms, listening for the knock of the inspector, wondering if the world's justice could really be weighed on a scale. The long wait. The medieval poor often waited long hours for bread. On days when flour was scarce, lines formed before dawn. Women stood with baskets, clutching coins, hoping the baker would have enough. Sometimes, they waited for hours only to be told that the day's loaves had sold out. To wait for bread was to wait for fairness, for the invisible system of fields, mills, taxes, and laws to hold together just long enough to keep hunger away. And when the bread finally came, warm, heavy, fragrant, it was more than food. It was proof that order still existed, that someone somewhere had kept the fire burning through the night. But what happens when the law of bread fails? When the loaves shrink, the scales tilt, and the crowd's hunger turns to anger? What happens when the baker himself becomes the symbol of injustice? When the assize of bread was first issued in 1266, it seemed like a triumph of reason, a simple, elegant equation to preserve fairness. But behind its neat tables of ounces and farthings, the kingdom was already trembling. England in the 13th century lived on the edge of subsistence. One bad harvest could unbalance everything. The assize could regulate the baker's scale, but it could not control the sky. The harvest of 1257, when bread turned bitter, the first great test came just a few years before the assize itself. In 1257, relentless rain flooded the fields across southern England. Grain rotted in the sheaves, roads turned to mud. The harvest failed almost everywhere. Chroniclers described the markets in tones of disbelief. Wheat sold at twice its normal price, then 3 times, then 5. The poor stopped buying bread altogether, living on barley, gruel, and wild herbs. In London, bakers faced an impossible choice. If they followed the assize, their loaves would have to shrink so small that no one could live on them. If they made them larger, they would lose money. Many simply stopped baking. For days, the The smell of bread disappeared from the streets. It was as though the city itself had stopped breathing. The famine that followed killed thousands. In monasteries, the records list dozens of dead brothers and servants. In villages, people ate seed grain, the future devoured by the present. When the fields finally dried, few had the strength to plant anew. The assize of bread could not feed the hungry, but it gave them something else, someone to blame. Bread and blame in medieval cities, the line between hunger and anger was thin. When the price of wheat rose, people suspected conspiracy. Rumors spread easily that millers were hoarding grain, that merchants were smuggling flour to France, that bakers were mixing sawdust or chalk into their dough. These suspicions were often unfounded, but they had a terrible power. A single accusation could draw a crowd, and a crowd could destroy a bakery in minutes. In 1258, chroniclers describe riots in London where angry citizens broke open grain stores, forcing merchants to sell wheat at honest prices. The mayor and sheriffs tried to restore order, but their own loyalty was questioned. The baker's oven, once a place of warmth and sustenance, became a symbol of greed. The law stepped in with harsh clarity. Any baker found guilty of selling light loaves was to be publicly punished. But even those who followed the rules were not always safe. The people did not trust scales, they trusted hunger. The assize in motion. To understand how the assize truly worked, imagine a typical week in a medieval market town. Every Saturday morning, the mayor and town officials met in the Guildhall to hear reports on grain prices. They calculated the official price of wheat, based on sales from local mills. Then, using the royal tables, they set the legal weight for a penny loaf. A clerk would write the numbers on parchment, and a crier would walk through the streets, ringing a bell, announcing the new standard. Let all bakers take heed. This week, a penny wastel shall weigh 4 pounds, 3 ounces, and the farthing loaf accordingly. Those who ignored the proclamation did so at their peril. Inspectors, carrying their brass scales, would visit the bakehouses. They carried small metal weights marked with the king's seal, the standard pound. A loaf was placed on one side, the weights on the other. Too light, and the baker was fined. Too heavy, and he was foolish, wasting flour. The best bakers developed a delicate skill. The loaf that just tipped the balance in their favor, neither too light nor too generous. The punishment for cheating remained the same, the pillory. There are records from London's court rolls detailing specific cases. John of Ely, baker, for light bread, to the pillory. William le Baker, for false wastel, to stand in the stocks 1 hour. Alice of Holborn, bakeress, immersed 1 penny for underweight loaves. These were small cases, but they accumulated. The law kept rhythm, as predictable as the church bells. The women of the oven baking was not only a man's trade. Many women, particularly widows, earned their living by baking bread from home. These women were often poorer, owning no ovens of their own. Instead, they took their dough to communal bakehouses, paying a small fee, known as oven rent, to use the heat. Records from the town of Nottingham list dozens of such women: Agnes at Ovine, Isolde le Bacchester, Matilda the widow bakeress. They were responsible for feeding entire neighborhoods. But the law was not gentle with them. When a loaf was found light, the fine fell upon the woman as swiftly as any man. The pillory, though mostly reserved for men, was sometimes used for women too. Or they were paraded through the streets holding their loaves as shameful proof. Some chroniclers note that these women often pleaded ignorance. The weights changed so often that even the most honest baker could fall behind. To bake bread was to gamble with the law. When bread failed, the Great Famine, by the early 14th century, long after Henry III's reign, the same laws remained in force. And then came the rain again. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe suffered one of the worst famines in centuries. Chroniclers wrote that the very air seemed to weep. Crops drowned, animals died of disease, and roads became impassable. In England, wheat prices tripled. Bakers could no longer buy grain. Even the rich complained of hunger. The assize, still technically binding, became impossible to follow. The government suspended it in some areas, but in others, it was enforced cruelly. Bakers were punished for loaves that were too small, even when they had no flour left to bake with. This contradiction exposed the fragility of medieval order. The law that once symbolized fairness had become a mockery. In 1316, the chronicler Henry Knighton wrote, "Men ate dogs and horses. The poor devoured roots of the ground, and still the bakers were punished for false bread." The price of hunger was no longer just the cost of wheat. It was the cost of maintaining the illusion of control. Markets of desperation, famine changed the markets themselves. Where once merchants sold by measure, they now sold by handful. Bakers, desperate to survive, mixed their dough with beans, peas, even acorns. The bread was dark, bitter and hard, but it filled the stomach. The church tried to intervene. Monasteries distributed loaves to the starving, often baking day and night to meet demand. Yet even charity had limits. When supplies ran out, the monks themselves starved. In one story from the Abbey of St. Albans, the prior ordered the last of the flour to be baked into bread for the townspeople. The monks ate nothing that week but broth made from grass and onions. The assize of bread was meant to ensure fairness. But in famine, fairness was irrelevant. What mattered was survival. A fragile order restored when the rains finally ended, and the harvest of 1318 brought grain again to the markets. The law returned as if nothing had happened. The officials resumed their weekly calculations. The pillories stood ready. But something had changed. People no longer trusted that the assize could protect them. They had seen hunger and death, and they knew that law was only as strong as the harvest. And yet, they obeyed it still. Not because it was perfect, but because it was familiar. In a world ruled by uncertainty, even a flawed system was better than none. The baker's work resumed. The dough was kneaded. The scales balanced once more. Bread, that most ordinary thing, remained the fragile thread between life and law. The unspoken truth behind all this regulation was a deeper assumption, that the king had a duty to feed his people. Medieval monarchs often spoke of keeping the peace of the loaf. When riots broke out, they were seen not only as crimes but as failures of kingship. This belief would shape politics for centuries. The idea that the state must guarantee basic fairness in food prices, that the poor must not starve while the rich eat, traces its roots to the assize of bread. The language has changed, but the expectation remains the ruler must ensure that the market serves justice, not greed. And yet one wonders, how just could such a system truly be, when justice itself depended on the weather? As the last loaves of the day cooled on their wooden racks, the baker wiped his hands and listened to the fading hum of the street. The inspectors had gone. The scales were still. Tomorrow the weight might change again. He did not know it, but his craft, this quiet, careful obedience to the ounce, was shaping the very foundation of English law. But what happened when the bakers themselves began to rebel? When the guilds, tired of fines and humiliation, demanded the right to set their own prices? What became of the king's control when the ovens turned collective and the law of bread met the law of labor? Bread is among the oldest human inventions, and yet in every age, people have tried to make rules for it. In the 13th and 14th centuries, those rules were the king's. By the 15th, they began to belong to the bakers themselves. From punishment to profession, after centuries of fines, pillories and inspections, bakers learned that they could survive best not by competing, but by cooperating. By the 1300s, towns across England saw the rise of craft guilds. Associations of artisans formed to protect their trade, set quality standards, and defend members from unfair punishment. The bakers were no exception. In London, they called themselves the Worshipful Company of Bakers, an organization that still exists today. Its origins go back at least to 1155, but it was during the 14th and 15th centuries that the guild grew powerful enough to matter. The guild was, in a sense, a new kind of law, made not by kings, but by craftsmen. Its members swore oaths to uphold honesty, to bake true weight, and to teach apprentices properly. It was both a brotherhood and a bureaucracy. Each new baker who joined paid a fee, took an oath, and agreed to abide by the guild's rules. In return, he gained protection, the right to bake without harassment from competitors or corrupt officials, and the right to sell within city limits. The assize of bread still existed, but the guild now helped enforce it. Inspectors were often drawn from the baker's own ranks. What had once been a system of punishment began to transform into one of self-regulation. The oven as a symbol in medieval towns, the bakehouse was more than a workplace. It was a communal center. People gathered there to exchange gossip, wait for their loaves, and warm themselves by the oven in winter. Some towns still had public bakehouses, where anyone could bring dough to be baked for a small fee. But as private ovens spread, the role of the communal bakehouse changed. It became a place of social life, the warmth of the community made literal. The oven itself came to symbolize both order and dependence. You could not live without it, yet few could afford their own. In many manorial records, peasants were legally required to use the lord's oven, paying a small tax, known as fernage, for every batch they baked. These little payments were the hidden threads of feudal life. Each loaf owed something to someone, a fraction to the miller, a share to the lord, a measure to the crown. Even the humblest crust carried the imprint of a vast, invisible system. The bakers' apprentices within the guilds, training became formal. Young apprentices, often boys of 12 or 13, were bound to a master baker for 7 years. They lived with the family, slept near the ovens, and worked long hours kneading, shaping, and tending fires. Apprenticeship was both education and servitude. It taught discipline, the feel of dough under one's hands, the precise color of a crust that was neither burnt nor pale, the rhythm of rising and baking that no clock could measure. When an apprentice completed his term, he became a journeyman, allowed to work for wages under another master, only after years of practice, and payment of a heavy freedom fee, could he open his own shop. Guild inspectors occasionally visited these apprenticeships to ensure fair treatment, but abuse was common. Some masters overworked their boys or denied them meat and ale. Others treated them like family. The assize of bread had regulated the loaf. The guild regulated the hands that made it. The Bakers' Charter in 1509, the Worshipful Company of Bakers, received a royal charter from King Henry V. The document granted them the right to control all bread making within the city of London, to test, to inspect, and to punish dishonest baking. It was, in effect, the final evolution of the assize. The law no longer came from above, but from within. The charter declared that no stranger nor foreign baker shall bake or sell any bread within the city, unless he be of the fellowship of bakers. It gave the guild the authority to search and assay bread sold in shops and markets, a right that once belonged to royal officials. The guild could fine, expel, or even imprison those who broke its rules. It was both a professional association and a court of law. This transfer of power marks a quiet revolution. What began as a royal decree to protect the people from fraud had become a mechanism for the bakers to protect themselves from outsiders. The assize had started as fairness. It ended as monopoly, the long shadow of the law. Even as the guilds flourished, the assize of bread remained technically in force. In many small towns, it continued to be proclaimed well into the 17th century. Local officials still weighed loaves, recorded prices, and fined bakers for false bread. But its spirit was fading. The economy was changing, trade was expanding, and money, not grain, determined prices. New forms of regulation emerged based on contracts and competition rather than fixed weights. In 1822, after more than 5.5 centuries, Parliament finally repealed the assize of bread. The repeal was quiet, almost unnoticed. The law had become obsolete, a relic of a world where every loaf was weighed by the crown. Yet its echoes remain. Modern consumer laws, the insistence that products be honestly measured, that prices be fair, that fraud be punished, all trace their ancestry to those medieval tables of ounces and pence. A loaf of bread, once a matter of royal decree, had become the foundation of economic trust. The taste of continuity, the bread itself, though, changed little. Manchet, Wastel, Maslin. The old varieties lingered, renamed and reinterpreted. The white loaves of the rich still contrasted with the coarse brown of the poor. Even in the age of machines and steam ovens, the social meaning of bread persisted. In rural England, bakers still rose before dawn, still dusted their arms with flour, still watched the dough swell under the heat. A baker in 1600 would have recognized much in the life of his 13th century ancestor: the same rhythm, the same fears of inspection, the same uneasy balance between necessity and law. Bread has always been the most democratic of foods, and yet the most controlled. Everyone needs it, but no one is entirely free to make it as they please. It is both freedom and obedience, a paradox baked into the crust. The quiet resilience of the bakers, the story of the bakers, is not one of rebellion, nor of triumph. It is a story of endurance, of ordinary people adapting to laws that changed slower than the weather. While kings rose and fell, while plagues swept the land, while cities burned and rebuilt, the bakers kept their ovens lit. They measured flour, counted pennies, weighed loaves, and began again each morning before dawn. Their patience sustained the kingdom more than any edict. Their dull, meticulous craft, the constant repetition of the same small tasks, held civilization together. Every crumb of bread eaten by a laborer, every loaf blessed in a church, every crust shared between friends carried a history of regulation, cooperation, and care. It is a boring history, but also a beautiful one. For in the end, the story of bread is the story of how people learn to live within limits and still find warmth. Echoes in modern times. When you buy a loaf today, sealed in plastic, labeled by weight and price, you are living inside the legacy of that medieval system. The barcode replaces the king's seal. The inspection comes from the scale at the factory, not the clerk of the market. Yet the purpose is the same: to protect the buyer from deceit, to ensure that what is promised is delivered. Behind every 500G printed on a wrapper lies a millennium-old anxiety. That trust in daily necessities must be guaranteed, not assumed. The bakers of the 13th century might not recognize your supermarket, but they would understand your receipt. It is, in its own way, an assize, a modern table of weights and measures, silently ensuring fairness one loaf at a time. The fire that never goes out in the end. Perhaps the truest legacy of the assize is not the law itself, but the image it left behind. A single baker standing before his oven, balancing justice and survival in the same breath. The law could change, the market could rise and fall, but the baker's fire never went out. It glowed quietly through the centuries, warming a world that always seemed one bad harvest away from despair. And even now, when bread is automatic and abundance seems endless, we are still, in a way, waiting for bread, waiting for that fragile balance between fairness and hunger to hold. Bread was never just food, it was order. It was faith. It was the promise that the world, though unfair and unpredictable, could still be measured in ounces, and that someone, somewhere, would stay awake through the night to make sure it was done right. In the Middle Ages, the setting of the sun marked more than the end of a day. It marked the end of public life. When darkness fell, towns and villages across Europe grew quiet, not from peace but from law. You might imagine medieval nights as full of noise, taverns, shouts, the bustle of people returning home. But for most, the evening bell told them something different, that it was time to put out the fire, bolt the door, and disappear indoors. This was the age of the curfew. The bell that ruled the night. The word curfew comes from the old French phrase cover the fire. Its origin was practical. In towns made almost entirely of timber and thatch, a single spark could consume hundreds of homes. Open hearths burned all day for cooking and warmth, and when night fell, every household was required to dampen or extinguish its fire. To signal this, a bell was rung from the local church or the town hall, the curfew bell. You can imagine the sound: slow, steady tolls rolling across narrow streets, echoing from rooftops and walls. In England, it usually rang at 8 or 9 o'clock, depending on the season. People would stir their coals, smother their embers with ash, and cover the hearth with an iron plate or pot. In that moment, the town exhaled. Light faded, smoke thinned, and the world grew still. The practical curfew. The curfew was not only about fires, it was about control. Once the bell rang, anyone found outdoors without permission risked suspicion. Guards or night watchmen patrolled the streets, calling out the hours, carrying lanterns or cudgels. Their job was to ensure that peace and property were maintained through the night. For the average townsman or woman, this meant that the rhythm of life was dictated by daylight. Work, trade, and movement all ceased at dusk. Inns closed, markets emptied, and even churches dimmed their candles. The curfew was both safety measure and social boundary, a signal that public space now belonged to authority. In rural areas, the rule was looser, but in walled towns, like Oxford, York, or Winchester, it was strict. The city gates were locked at curfew. Late travellers found themselves outside, stranded for the night in fields or roadside inns. For those within the walls, the sound of the curfew bell meant that the world was, at least temporarily, sealed. A kingdom of bells, the practice spread across Europe. William the Conqueror is often credited with introducing the curfew to England after 1066, though historians debate whether it was truly his invention or simply a Norman custom extended to his new realm. Chroniclers tell us that William ordered all fires to be covered at 8 o'clock each night, and that the bell was to ring in every town to remind the people. Some Englishmen, resenting Norman rule, claimed this was tyranny, a symbol of foreign control, but others recognized its purpose. A curfew saved lives. Fires were the single greatest threat to medieval towns. In 1212, the Great Fire of London destroyed most of the city south of St. Paul's, killing thousands who were trapped by collapsing bridges. Similar fires ravaged York, Lincoln, and Bruges. In response, authorities tightened the curfew laws. Bells were rung more punctually, and watchmen were given authority to inspect houses where smoke was seen after hours. The curfew, then, was not simply a moral command. It was urban policy, a primitive but effective form of disaster prevention. The sound of nightfall, imagine it: a medieval town just after sunset. The last merchants are closing their shutters. A boy runs through the market square, his bare feet slapping the stones, carrying bread home before the gates close. Then the bell begins. It rings slow and deep, echoing from the tower, mingling with the sound of church bells from nearby parishes. The dogs bark, The wind carries the tolling through narrow alleys where the air smells of smoke and horses. Inside their homes, people move quietly. A woman stirs the coals, sprinkles water, sets a lid over the fire. A man checks the latch on the door. Children whisper as the light fades. By the time the bell stops, the town has fallen into silence, a silence so complete that even the creak of a wooden sign can sound like a voice. This was not fear exactly. It was habit, the comfort of routine, the knowledge that the world outside could wait until dawn. The watchman after the bell, another group awoke the night watch. They were the eyes of the town after dark. Part police, part sentries, part alarm system. Armed with staves and sometimes accompanied by dogs, they walked the streets in pairs or trios, carrying lanterns hung on poles. Their duties were varied. They checked for open flames, listened for signs of fighting or theft, and stopped strangers to question them. In larger towns, they called out the time, 10 o'clock and all's well, a practice that survived into the 19th century. Some watchmen were respected, others were feared or mocked. The job was dull, poorly paid, and often dangerous. In some places, the watchmen were recruited from the local population by rotation, every able-bodied man required to serve several nights a year. In others, it was a permanent post held by veterans or the poor. Their presence reminded everyone that the night belonged to the law. Fire, fear, and faith. The medieval world was obsessed with the boundary between order and chaos, and nothing embodied that boundary more than fire. To the people of the 13th century, fire was both divine and destructive, a gift from God, but also his tool for punishment. The curfew, therefore, had moral weight. To neglect it was to court disaster, even sin. Church sermons warned that careless householders might bring judgment upon entire towns. The phrase fire and brimstone was not a metaphor. It was a memory of real, physical ruin. Many towns kept communal buckets and ladders ready in case of flames. Some even organized fire watches that lasted until midnight. But the most effective prevention was obedience to the bell. When you heard it, you did not argue. You covered your fire, you prayed, and you waited for morning. Curfews and class. As with all medieval rules, curfews did not apply equally to everyone. The wealthy could sometimes pay for exemptions. Nobles, clerics, or wealthy merchants were allowed to keep lamps burning for study, work, or prayer. Some monasteries were granted permission to ring their own bells later at night. Tavern keepers and innkeepers often stretched the limits, serving ale behind shuttered windows after curfew, risking fines if caught. The poor, who lived in single-room homes with open hearths, were the ones most often punished. In towns like Coventry or Bristol, constables fined those whose chimneys still smoked after the bell. Records show fines of 1 or 2 pence, small but meaningful in a time when bread itself cost a farthing. Even in the darkness, inequality held firm. The silence as law for the modern mind. The curfew might seem oppressive, a strange intrusion into private life. But to medieval people it represented order. Night was dangerous. Without streetlights, every shadow could hide a thief. Wolves and wild dogs sometimes prowled the outskirts of towns. Spirits and devils, too, were believed to roam more freely after dark. The silence imposed by the bell created a sense of safety. Each closed door, each extinguished flame, was part of a collective effort to keep fear outside the walls. The town's quiet was not emptiness, it was defense. In some places, people even referred to the curfew as the peace of the night. When you went to bed, you did so knowing that the bell had sealed the world shut, at least until morning. The bell that never truly stopped. By the late 14th century, the curfew began to change. Fires were still feared, but towns were growing larger, wealthier, and more active. Trade required longer hours. Scholars worked by candlelight. Inns stayed open for travelers arriving after sunset. The bell continued to ring, but it became more symbolic than strict. In many towns, it served as a reminder rather than a command. People covered their fires but did not always go to bed. Some places even turned the curfew bell into a timekeeping signal, the medieval equivalent of a clock striking 9. The law was still there, but its meaning had softened. Night was no longer a forbidden realm, but a quieter continuation of the day. And yet, even centuries later, the bell continued to sound. Some English towns still ring it today, not as law but as memory. The curfew began as a way to keep fires from spreading, but it became something larger, a symbol of order, silence, and the fragile safety of sleep. Yet, as the centuries went on and the towns grew brighter, what happened to those who refused to stay silent? To the night workers, the smugglers, the lonely monks, and the poets who walked after the bell. When the curfew bell finished tolling and the last doors had closed, a strange kind of life began. The town was still, yet not empty. Beneath the weight of silence, there moved a hidden population, people who belonged to the hours after dusk. For every law that demanded sleep, there was someone who had reason to wake. The watchman's march, the watchmen were the first to emerge. Wrapped in thick cloaks against the chill, they carried staffs or halberds, and the small metal lanterns that swayed with each step. Their boots echoed against the cobblestones, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the empty air. They often walked in pairs, not only for safety, but because company kept them alert. The night could lull a man into a kind of waking dream. The steady creak of signs in the wind, the sound of shutters rattling, the distant bark of dogs. Their patrol routes were mapped by habit. Along the market square, through the butcher's row, around the churchyard, and down to the river gates. In some towns, the watchmen paused every hour to call the time. Their voices broke the silence like a ritual chant. 10 o'clock and all's well! 11 o'clock. Fire and light beware! The calls were both reassurance and warning, proof that someone still kept watch while others slept. But not everyone welcomed the watchmen. They were reminders of rules, of fines, of unwanted attention. For those who worked or wandered after curfew, the sight of a lantern's glow could mean trouble. The bakers, the millers, and the smiths, while the curfew was meant to quiet towns, some trades could not wait for daylight. Bakers, for example, began their work in the darkest hours. Bread was the backbone of medieval life, and by sunrise, it was expected to be ready for sale. That meant dough had to be kneaded and ovens stoked long before dawn. In many towns, bakers were granted special licenses to keep their fires burning after curfew. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same law that forbade open flames made exceptions for the one profession that relied on them. The baker's quarter was a strange sight at midnight. Soft glows of firelight leaking through shutter cracks, the smell of yeast and smoke rising into the air. A watchman passing by might nod to a baker stirring his coals, both men knowing that the bell's rule bent for necessity. Millers, too, sometimes worked at night. Watermills clattered by rivers outside the city walls, turning grain into flour even after the gates were locked. Blacksmiths, though rare after dusk, occasionally hammered by lamplight when urgent repairs were needed. A broken horseshoe, a bent hinge, a merchant's wagon axle. In every darkened town there were always a few fires still flickering, legally or not. The tavern shadows, then there were the taverns, homes of the curfew's quiet rebellion. Though the law said they must close, many kept serving behind shuttered windows. The doors were bolted from within, and a single candle or two might be hidden beneath a hooded lamp. Regular patrons knew to knock softly 3 times to be admitted. Inside, the air was warm and thick with owl. Voices were low, laughter muffled. These after-curfew gatherings were not the wild scenes of popular imagination. They were hushed, cautious, conspiratorial. Sometimes they were harmless, townsmen lingering to talk about trade or gossip. But sometimes they were places where smugglers met or discontent found a whisper. The authorities knew this, which is why watchmen sometimes pressed their ears to the doors of taverns or walked by slowly listening. To be caught with lights burning after curfew could mean a fine, but for the tavern keeper the risk was worth it. Night drinkers paid well for secrecy. The monks who never slept while the towns slept under curfew, the monasteries followed a different rhythm, one older and more unbending. The monastic day was divided into 8 canonical hours, and several of them fell at night. The first was matins, sometimes begun at midnight or even earlier, followed by lauds just before dawn. When the town bells had fallen silent, the abbey bells took over. You can imagine the sound, thinner, higher, ringing over the dark fields beyond the town walls. Monks stirred from sleep, pulled on rough habits, and filed silently to the chapel. There, they sang psalms by candlelight, their voices echoing off cold stone walls. Outside, the wind pressed against the stained glass, and beyond it, the world was perfectly still. To the monks, the curfew was not law but devotion. Their nights belonged not to kings or councils, but to God. In a sense, they were the watchmen of the soul, keeping vigil when the rest of the world surrendered to sleep. For the townsfolk who lived near abbeys, the sound of those distant bells was a reminder that the night was not empty. Someone was always awake. Travellers at the gate outside the walls, the story was different. The gates of most medieval towns were locked at curfew, and not opened again until morning. Travellers arriving late were forced to find lodging at roadside inns or in barns. Some, desperate or unwary, tried to climb the walls or bribe the gatekeeper. Gatekeepers, in turn, were minor officials with surprising power. They held the keys, literally, to safety. Many kept small huts near the gate, where they slept lightly through the night, waking at the sound of knocking or hoofbeats. Records tell of merchants pleading for entry, of messengers bearing royal letters, even of soldiers demanding passage after curfew. Sometimes the gatekeeper yielded, especially if the traveler offered a few coins. But often, the answer was simple: wait until morning. Inside the walls, the town might dream in peace. Outside, by the flickering light of a tallow candle or a dying campfire, strangers huddled together, waiting for dawn for warmth, for the next day's trade. Crime and punishment in the dark, despite the curfew's intention. Not all nights were peaceful. Darkness hid both opportunity and danger. Thieves favored the hours after curfew precisely because the streets were empty. Without lamplight, without guards at every corner, they could slip through alleys unseen. Burglary, in particular, was a common crime. Wooden shutters could be pried open, and many houses had only simple locks. To fight this, towns organized special night watches beyond the usual patrols. In London, for example, ward constables were required to keep armed men stationed at crossroads and markets through the night. They carried horns or bells to raise the alarm, yet justice was uneven. A man caught outdoors after curfew could be accused of intent to steal, even if he was simply walking home late. Court records from the 14th century show many such arrests. A cobbler detained for wandering by the fish market after the bell, a servant accused of idleness and drunkenness past curfew. Punishments varied: small fines, time in the stocks, or, in severe cases, imprisonment. The night, it seemed, had its own laws, and even the innocent could stumble over them. Women of the night, not all who walked after curfew did so by choice. In nearly every medieval town, there existed a population of women who worked outside the law's light. Sex workers, known by various euphemisms: daughters of joy, nightwalkers, or simply women of ill repute. Curfew laws were often written with them in mind. Town councils blamed them for disturbing the peace of the night. In 1383, the city of York ordered that no woman of loose life shall be found abroad after the bell. Of course, such rules were unenforceable. The women continued their work, usually near taverns or at the edges of the town walls. They were fined, arrested, and released in cycles that filled court records for centuries. Their presence reminds us that the curfew, like all systems of order, was selective, designed to protect some while controlling others. For many women, survival itself meant living beyond the law's comfort. In their footsteps, the curfew's silence became not peace, but exclusion. The secret fire. There's something human in the desire to keep one small light burning after the world has gone dark. Even among law-abiding citizens, not everyone obeyed the curfew perfectly. Some households kept a single coal alive under ash, a secret ember for morning. Others lit a candle to mend clothes, read, or simply watch the fire flicker. The penalty was mild if discovered, but the act carried a quiet defiance. It was a refusal to surrender entirely to regulation. In that dim light, perhaps families whispered stories, lovers exchanged words, or an old man traced the beads of his rosary. History rarely records these moments, but they form the unseen texture of medieval life, the private, stubborn warmth of people who refused to be extinguished. The bell and the stars outside. The watchmen moved through the stillness, their lanterns small against the vastness of the night sky. Without city lights, the stars were overwhelming, rivers of light across the heavens, the Milky Way a pale haze stretching from horizon to horizon. Travelers often used the stars to find their way, but townsmen saw them differently. To them, the heavens were both beautiful and humbling, proof of divine order mirrored by earthly law. The curfew bell, in a sense, was an echo of that order, the human attempt to impose rhythm upon chaos. As above, so below. The stars moved in their courses, the bells rang in their hours. But even as the bell's authority shaped the town below, the vast silence above reminded everyone of their smallness, and perhaps of the futility of trying to control the dark. The medieval night was never truly still. It was full of quiet motion, of bakers and monks, of watchmen and wanderers, of hidden fires and whispered voices. For some, it was safety. For others, confinement. For all, it was a reminder that law could not entirely silence life. And yet, as the centuries passed and towns grew brighter, what became of the curfew itself? When fire gave way to lamps, and lamps to gaslight, did the bell still rule the night? By the dawn of the Renaissance, the sound of the curfew bell still rolled through the narrow streets of Europe. But its meaning was changing. The medieval world that had once bowed to its rhythm was shifting. Fire, fear, and darkness were slowly giving way to invention, order, and light. Yet for centuries the curfew endured. a stubborn echo of an older age, clinging to habit long after its necessity had faded. This final chapter belongs to its decline, and to the quiet transformation of the night itself. The fire grows tamer. At the heart of the curfew's story was fire, wild, essential, and unpredictable. For generations, open hearths had burned at the center of every home. But by the late 15th century, architecture began to change. Stone chimneys became more common, allowing smoke to vent safely. Houses were built with tile roofs instead of thatch. Towns, once tinderboxes, grew more resistant to flame. With safety came confidence. The curfew's warnings seemed less urgent. Bells still rang, but people no longer rushed to cover their fires. Many simply let them burn low on their own. And as fire grew tame, night itself began to lose its terror. Oil lamps and tallow candles, though expensive, became more widely used. Wealthy households installed iron sconces on their walls. Monasteries kept lamps burning in hallways. Gradually, the darkness was pushed back, not entirely, but enough to alter the rhythm of life. It was the beginning of the end for the medieval night. Merchants, markets, and midnight work, the growing towns of the 15th and 16th centuries, were no longer bound entirely to the sun. Trade had expanded. Ships sailed from Bristol, Lobeck, and Venice carrying goods across oceans. Caravans arrived after sunset. Wagons creaked through the gates at dawn. The hum of commerce no longer stopped when the bell rang. In many cities, the curfew law still existed, but it was quietly ignored. Bakers worked later, taverns stayed open longer, and merchants used the night to tally accounts or load goods. Records from Antwerp and Florence describe warehouses lit by candles, clerks working through the dark to keep up with trade. The town watch still patrolled, but now their duties leaned more toward order than enforcement. The night had become not forbidden, but simply another shift of labor. A few towns even introduced second bells, one for the curfew, and another later to mark midnight or early morning. The bells had once signaled obedience, now they simply measured time. The age of light and lanterns. By the 17th century, a quiet revolution was underway, the lighting of the streets. In Paris in 1667, King Louis IV ordered that every street be lit by oil lamps. Glass lanterns were hung from iron hooks above the cobblestones, their light reflected in the puddles of rain. The same happened soon after in Amsterdam, London, and other great cities. The effect was transformative. The night, once a time of danger and mystery, became a new kind of public space. People began to walk, socialize, and even conduct business after dark. Taverns glowed openly, not secretly. Night markets appeared. The bell still rang, but few listened. It had become a relic, part of the city's soundscape, no longer an order but a memory. Ironically, as towns grew brighter, they also grew less secure. Light drew people outdoors, crime adapted. The watchmen were now called constables or lamplighters, and their duties changed with the times. Yet beneath the gaslight, something ancient remained, that faint echo of the curfew's purpose, to keep chaos at bay. When the bell became tradition in England, the curfew law had officially lost its teeth by the 16th century. But the sound of the bell endured, long after anyone remembered why it rang. Church wardens' records from the 1600s mention payments to the curfew bell ringer, even though no law required it. Some parishes continued the ritual out of habit. Others claimed it was for the good of the town's order. In Oxford, the great Tom Bell of Christ Church still rings 101 times every night at 9:05, a tradition said to recall the original curfew of the medieval university. In other English towns, such as Sandwich, Shrewsbury, and Rye, curfew bells ring even now, echoing customs almost 1,000 years old. No one rushes to cover their fire anymore. The sound has become gentle, nostalgic, a connection to a time when law and silence ruled the night. It is no longer a command, but a comfort. The watchman's last rounds. Even as the curfew faded, the watchmen remained. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, they continued to patrol cities at night, lanterns swaying, calling the hours. But their role had changed. They were now guardians of property and peace, not enforcers of fire laws. Their familiar cry, 10 o'clock and all's well, became a fixture of urban life, half reassurance, half ritual. In London, night watchmen became notorious for their slowness and sleepiness. The poet William Cowper joked that they slumbered with their halberds, waking only to cry the hour. Yet even their drowsy presence gave the illusion of order, a human rhythm beneath the ticking of clocks. By the 19th century, the modern police had replaced them, and gaslight illuminated every street. But for centuries, they had been the curfew's living legacy, a reminder that someone, somewhere, still watched the dark. The echo of fear. Though the curfew law disappeared, its spirit survived in times of crisis. Whenever danger threatened, plague, fire, rebellion, towns reinstated temporary curfews. The idea that safety could be restored by silence, by separating night from day, never truly left the human mind. In 1666, when the Great Fire of London raged for 4 days, officials ordered all fires extinguished at night, a desperate echo of William the Conqueror's old decree. In times of war or unrest, curfews returned again and again, always with the same logic: safety through stillness. It seems that even in modernity, the instinct to control the night, to impose quiet, remains. The medieval curfew had been born of fear, but it was also born of reason, the simple understanding that peace requires boundaries. The rhythm of sleep before clocks and electric light, people's lives were ruled by natural cycles of light and dark. Historians now believe that medieval people practiced what we would call segmented sleep. They went to bed after the curfew bell, woke in the middle of the night for an hour or two, then slept again until dawn. That middle waking period, the watch, was a time for prayer, quiet talk, or tending the fire. The curfew bell marked the first sleep. The morning bells marked the second. Between them, the human body found its rhythm, tied to the same pulse as the bells outside. Even after the curfew ended, the pattern lingered. The phrase, first sleep, survived in writings into the 18th century, long after towns had outgrown their night laws. The bell, the body, and the dark had once moved in harmony, an ancient partnership between time, nature, and necessity. The modern bell, if you visit certain English towns today, you can still hear the curfew bell. In the small market town of Sandwich, Kent, it rings each evening at 8. In Shrewsbury, the curfew bell tolls from St. Alkmund's Church as it has since the Middle Ages. In Chertsey, Surrey, it still rings at 8 p.m, said to honour a 14th century fire law. No one rushes to cover their hearths anymore, of course, but as the sound drifts through the streets, soft, solemn, and slow, it connects the present to 1,000 forgotten nights. It is the same sound that once signalled fear, obedience, and relief, the same sound that told bakers to work, lovers to hide, and watchmen to wake. Now it is simply memory, the echo of a world that found peace in silence. What the curfew left behind when you strip away the rules, fines, and rituals, the medieval curfew reveals something surprisingly gentle: a collective agreement to rest. It was a law, yes, but also a shared act of care. Each covered fire protected not only a household but the neighbours next door. Each closed door helped preserve the fragile quiet of the night. The bell united everyone, rich and poor, faithful and wary, under a single rhythm. It was, in a strange way, the sound of community. Modern cities never sleep, their lights never dim. Yet there's something haunting in the thought of a time when an entire town grew still at once, when silence itself was law. The last curfew bells of Europe continue to ring, not to warn of fire, but to remind us of that long, slow age when humanity measured its nights by sound, not light. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine that distant toll, a bell echoing across stone streets, carrying through the cool air. Its voice has grown faint with time, but it has never truly stopped. And if you listen closely enough, you might still hear it, calling you to rest as it once called all of Europe. In medieval Europe, bread was not just food, it was survival. Every morning, the air of a town would fill with the soft scent of baking. From Paris to York, from Bruges to Florence, bakers rose long before dawn to knead dough by candlelight, turning flour, water, and salt into the daily miracle that kept towns alive. And because bread was life, it was also law. The medieval world had many strange and rigid rules, but few were watched so closely as those that governed the making of bread. For in a society where famine was never far away, the baker's honesty became a matter of public order. Too light a loaf, and it was seen not merely as cheating, but as betrayal. The assize of bread in 13th century England. King Henry III issued a remarkable decree known as the Assize of Bread and Isles around 1267. It was one of the first national food laws in European history. This law dictated, in astonishing detail, the precise weight a loaf of bread must have, depending on the current price of wheat. The system worked like a sliding scale. When wheat was cheap, loaves had to be large. When wheat was expensive, bakers were allowed to sell smaller loaves for the same price. But at all times, the ratio between price and weight was fixed by law. It was mathematics in the service of fairness, and it was deadly serious. Town officials known as bread weighers or aisle tasters were appointed to enforce it. They carried brass scales through the markets, testing loaves and measuring all mugs. Any baker caught cheating, by lightening the loaf, watering the aisle, or using poor flour, faced heavy fines or public punishment. It wasn't just regulation, it was moral order. The medieval loaf grain grit, And bread in medieval times was rarely the soft, white loaf we imagine today. For most people it was dark, coarse and dense, made from a mix of rye, barley or oats, often with bits of husk or even straw. Stones from the grinding process frequently found their way into the dough, wearing down teeth over years of eating. Wheat, the grain of the rich, was precious. Its bread, called manchet in England or pain blanc in France, was pale, fine and expensive. For the poor, such bread was a luxury glimpsed only at feasts or through the windows of the wealthy. Most bakers worked not for the rich but for survival, balancing on a knife edge between profit and punishment. A bad harvest could ruin them. A few ounces short on the scales could destroy their reputation, or worse. The Bakers' Guild and the bread weighers. By the 14th century, many towns had formed bakers' guilds, organizations that regulated apprenticeships, prices, and ingredients. But even within these guilds, the shadow of the assize of bread loomed large. Guild members were expected to bake in accordance with the law, and inspectors often visited bakehouses to test compliance. These inspectors, the alconers and bread weighers, were not loved. In some records from London and York, they are accused of corruption or bullying, demanding bribes in exchange for leniency. Yet they were feared more than hated, for they carried real power, the authority to confiscate bread, impose fines, or even have a baker's tools destroyed. Public humiliation was the most common punishment. In towns like Bristol or Norwich, dishonest bakers were tied to a cart and paraded through the streets, their loaves hung around their necks as symbols of shame. In others, they were placed in the pillory, their faces exposed to jeers, rotten food, or stones. For repeat offenders, imprisonment was not uncommon. A light loaf was not a small mistake. It was a civic crime, an assault on trust itself. Bread as the measure of justice. Why such severity over something so small? Because bread was more than food, it was stability. In an age when famine could sweep through a kingdom after a single bad harvest, keeping bread prices fair meant preserving social peace. Bread riots were real and frequent. In France, long before the Revolution, mobs had stormed bakeries over shortages. In England, towns kept emergency stocks of grain in fortified, corn barns, guarded like treasure. The assize of bread wasn't just an economic law. It was a safeguard against chaos. By setting the weight and price of loaves, the crown and local authorities could claim they were protecting the people from greed and starvation. A dishonest baker wasn't merely cheating a customer, he was endangering the moral fabric of the town. Every loaf sold in a marketplace was thus an act of social trust. Bread and the church. Even the church was involved in bread's regulation. In monasteries, baking was both a daily duty and a sacred act. Monks baked bread for themselves, for guests, and for the poor. But the same precision and discipline applied. Recipes were recorded in detail. The size and number of loaves distributed to beggars were carefully measured. The symbolism ran deep. Bread represented Christ's body. Its fairness, purity, and equality held spiritual meaning. To cheat in bread was, in a sense, to cheat God. In fact, some ecclesiastical courts in England and France tried bakers for dishonesty, particularly if they sold underweight bread to monasteries or pilgrims. A baker might be forced to confess before his peers, restore the lost weight in flour, or make offerings to the church as penance. Even in faith, law and loaf were intertwined. A baker's day. To understand the strain of this life, imagine a medieval baker at work. He rises at midnight, perhaps earlier, when the rest of the town is asleep. His oven, made of stone and fueled by wood, must be heated hours in advance. The flour, purchased from a local mill, is unpredictable, sometimes coarse, sometimes damp. He measures water by sight, salt by hand. There are no scales in his home, only instinct and repetition. The dough must rise, then be shaped, scored, and baked before dawn when the first customers arrive. If the loaves are too light, he risks a fine. If too heavy, he loses profit. If a fire burns too hot, he scorches the crust and ruins the batch at sunrise. The bread weigher might appear, unannounced, to test the day's work. One mistake, 1 ounce short, and a day's labor could end in disgrace. This was not merely commerce, it was survival by precision. The baker's dozen. It was in this world of risk and regulation that one of history's most enduring phrases was born: the baker's dozen. To avoid punishment for selling short-weight bread, bakers began adding an extra loaf for every dozen sold, giving 13 instead of 12. The custom was practical, but it also became symbolic, a gesture of honesty in a world of suspicion. It meant safety for the baker and generosity for the buyer. By the 15th century, the phrase, baker's dozen, had become common throughout England, and it still survives today. a linguistic echo of a time when bread was measured not only in ounces but in consonants. Bread, justice, and the crown. Over the centuries, kings and councils continued to adjust and reaffirm the assize of bread. Each revision was accompanied by new tables of weight and price, complex charts that few modern eyes could easily decipher. They listed the price of wheat in shillings and the corresponding legal weight of loaves, down to the ounce. These tables were often displayed publicly, nailed to the doors of town halls or market crosses. Ordinary citizens could, in theory, read them to ensure fairness. In practice, few could read at all, but the symbolism mattered. The king's justice, they were told, extended even to their breakfast. A town in panic imagined for a moment a bad harvest year, say 1316, during the Great Famine that swept across northern Europe. Grain prices had doubled, even tripled. People grew desperate. Bakers struggled to afford flour. Those who cut corners were punished. Those who refused to bake at all were threatened. In London and York, towns ordered bakers to continue production regardless of cost, even if they lost money. In Paris, records show officials forcing bakers to sell bread at fixed prices for the salvation of the people. To disobey was to risk prison. To comply was to risk starvation. The assize demanded justice, but famine obeyed no law. As you drift into the slow rhythm of these old ovens and markets, consider this: for centuries, the weight of a loaf could determine a man's freedom, the peace of a city, or the wrath of a king. What happens then, when a law meant to ensure fairness begins to crush the very people who feed the world? The scent of bread in a medieval city was not merely pleasant. It was political. In towns where hunger could stir rebellion faster than sermons or taxes, the baker's oven became a symbol of both nourishment and control. And behind every warm loaf lay a delicate balance between the needs of the people and the power of the crown. By the 14th and 15th centuries, this balance was under constant strain. The assize of bread had promised fairness, but fairness is difficult to measure in ounces. What happened when the scales of law and hunger no longer aligned? The wheat crisis. The medieval economy was as fragile as the harvest. One wet summer could destroy crops across whole regions. Too much rain and wheat rotted in the field. Too little, and it withered. Transportation was slow, storage unreliable, and the poor had no reserves. When grain ran short, prices soared. And when prices soared, bakers faced an impossible choice: bake smaller loaves to cover costs and risk punishment, or obey the assize and go bankrupt. In the early 14th century, the Great Famine of 1315-1317 struck northern Europe. Torrential rains destroyed crops for 3 consecutive years. Chroniclers wrote of fields standing in water, cattle dying of disease, and people digging up roots to survive. The assize of bread still demanded fair weight, but fairness meant ruin. In London, inspectors patrolled the markets daily, seizing loaves and fining bakers who dared to bake small. In Paris, the Prévôt, the city's chief official, ordered that all bread be sold at the accustomed weight, regardless of cost. It was, as one baker in Bruges wrote bitterly, the law of the rich man's stomach. Bread and riot when hunger reached the streets. The crowd did not look to the king. It looked to the bakers. In 1258, 1293, 1316, and again in 1381, London saw bread riots, moments when starving townsfolk stormed bakeries, seized loaves, or forced bakers to sell at just prices. The baker's shop, warm and fragrant, became the focus of fury. It was visible, tangible, a target for the invisible injustice of hunger. Records describe mobs shouting, "Give us bread as the law commands!" The irony was cruel. The very law meant to protect them had become their cry for vengeance. In France, too, the pain du roi, the king's bread, became a symbol of resentment. Royal bakers who supplied noble households were protected from penalties, even as ordinary bakers faced ruin. In Dijon and Rouen, bakeries were attacked, ovens smashed, grain seized. Each riot was a reminder that bread was power, and those who baked it stood perilously close to its flame. The bakers' pleas gild records from cities like York, Ghent, and Florence reveal a chorus of frustration from bakers pleading for mercy. In a petition from 1340, the London Bakers' Guild begged city officials to moderate the penalties of the assize during times of dearth, arguing that no man may bake without loss. Another record from Florence's Art dei Forni Bakers' Guild demanded that bakers be allowed to adjust the size of loaves according to the burden of grain. Some towns listened, others did not. In places where officials refused to relent, bakers turned to quiet defiance. They baked by night, sold loaves secretly to friends, or hid flour to avoid inspection. It was a dangerous game, and if caught, the punishment was harsh. Yet it was also an act of survival, not rebellion. Bakers were trapped between the hunger of their neighbors and the blindness of law. The smell of justice. Imagine walking through a medieval marketplace at dawn. The ground is damp with morning mist. The clang of iron scales echoes beneath the shouts of merchants. You smell roasted meat, tanned leather, and, strongest of all, bread. Near the market cross stands a wooden platform, the pillory. Today, a baker is bound there, head and hands locked in the stocks. Around his neck hangs a single loaf of bread, too small. The crowd has been told, too light for its price. Children throw crusts, a few women spit. Others watch in silence. The smell of his own bread still drifts through the square. It is a ritual humiliation, meant not to wound but to warn. The crowd is reminded that justice is tangible, that a loaf has weight, and so does guilt. Yet beneath the spectacle lies something deeper: fear. The town knows that tomorrow another baker could stand there, another oven could fail, another harvest could die. The bread law does not solve hunger. It only reminds people who will be blamed for it. The baker's household behind the oven, life was equally precarious. Most bakers lived where they worked, their homes attached to the bakehouse, the air thick with flour and smoke. Apprentices slept beside the ovens, rising at midnight to knead dough. The work was relentless, one batch finished as another began. Flour dust clung to everything, the floor, the walls, their hair. The heat from the ovens was unbearable in summer, and the cold at night seeped through the cracks in winter. Bakers' wives often handled sales at the front of the shop, while children fetched wood, ground grain, or carried bread to customers. Every member of the family labored to keep the balance between cost and law. When inspectors came, it was a household ordeal. The family would hold their breath as the official weighed a loaf. If it passed, relief; if not, a fine that could mean hunger for weeks. Bread was never just baked, it was endured. Loaves of luxury in wealthier quarters, however, bread was transforming. The 15th century saw the rise of pain de luxe, white, refined bread made from sifted wheat flour. This bread was light, tender, and pure, baked for nobles, clergy, and the prosperous middle class. In London, these were called wastel, or cocket, loaves, the finest kind. Bakers who produced them were often exempt from the harshest punishments, since their clients were powerful. The poor noticed. Chroniclers record angry mutterings in markets. The law weighs the poor man's loaf, but not the rich man's. When famine struck, it was always the brown, coarse bread that disappeared first, never the golden loaves on noble tables. The assize had promised equality, but in practice it deepened division. Even bread, the most universal of foods, had become a marker of class. Foreign loaves and local laws. Interestingly, the laws of bread were not unique to England. Across Europe, variations of the same system appeared. In the German cities of the Hanseatic League, guilds strictly controlled the size and price of loaves. In Florence, a baker could be fined for using imported grain without permission. In Paris, bakers were forbidden to bake during certain church feasts to ensure that flour supplies were reserved for sacred bread. Each city had its own charts, its own inspectors, its own punishments, yet all shared the same fear, the fear of hunger, of fire, of disorder. And so, in dozens of languages and hundreds of towns, the same story unfolded. The baker caught between oven and authority, warmth and want. The loaf and the law. By the late Middle Ages, the system had grown so complex that many towns published full bread tables, printed or carved lists showing exactly how much a loaf should weigh for every possible grain price. In London, these tables were updated weekly. In Florence, they were posted on the doors of the Palazzo della Signoria. But the tables were imperfect. They could not account for weather, for flour quality, for the small errors of human labor. And so bakers were fined again and again, not for greed but for inaccuracy. Justice, like bread, had grown stale. An honest loaf, yet there were those who endured, who found dignity in the simplicity of their craft. In a record from Norwich in 1479, one baker named Alice Hunt was praised by the town council for keeping the assize faithfully these 40 years. Her loaves were known for their fairness in weight and quality. She was allowed to display the town's seal, a mark of trust, above her shop door. Alice's success was rare, but it shows that even in the strictest systems, honesty could bring quiet honor. Most bakers, though, simply hoped to survive another day's weighing. The law was not designed for mercy, it was designed for order. As the centuries turned and the ovens burned on, one question lingered in every town, whispered in every bakery at night. If the bread is meant to feed the people, why does the law so often starve the baker? By the dawn of the modern age, the baker's craft had survived war, famine, plague, and punishment. But the ancient assize of bread, that strict and solemn measure of the medieval world, was beginning to crumble. For centuries, kings and councils had watched over the weight of loaves, the price of grain, and the honesty of bakers. Yet by the 17th and 18th centuries, the rhythm of the world had changed. Markets had grown larger, money more complex, and the reach of law less certain. The baker's oven was no longer the center of civic justice. It was becoming what it had always secretly been, a place of work, of warmth, and of quiet survival. The cracks in the system, the first cracks in the assize, appeared quietly. In some English towns by the 1600s, inspectors were showing up less often. Enforcement was patchy, fines irregular. The charts of loaf weights were out of date before they were posted, and bakers, exhausted by centuries of surveillance, simply stopped caring. One London official complained in 1631 that the bakers of this city take no regard to the ancient assize, nor fear of the penalty thereof. It wasn't rebellion, it was resignation. The medieval system of bread control depended on stability, steady harvests, predictable prices, obedient bakers. But the 17th century was an age of upheaval, plague, fire, and civil war. London burned in 1666. Whole towns were rebuilt. New forms of trade, taxation, and currency transformed the economy. The weight of bread was no longer the measure of justice. It had become a relic of a world that believed fairness could be counted in ounces. The age of markets, as Europe's towns grew into cities, bread changed from a public trust into a commodity. In the great markets of Paris, Amsterdam, and London, flour was now traded in bulk, prices fluctuating daily with demand. Wealthy merchants, not local guilds, controlled supply. The old idea that every town's bread must be equal and fixed by law became impossible. Governments tried to cling to it. In France, royal decrees in the 17th century still set official bread prices, but enforcement was chaotic. When the Paris police attempted to punish bakers for light loaves, riots broke out. In Lyon and Rouen, starving crowds broke into granaries, shouting, "La pain du roi!" The king's bread, the bread of justice. The irony was bitter. The more the crown tried to control bread, the more unstable the market became. By the 18th century, some economists were beginning to argue that bread should be free. That is, governed by supply and demand, not by royal decree. The idea was radical, dangerous, and yet inevitable. The fall of the assize in England. The assize of bread finally collapsed under its own weight. After more than 5 centuries, it was formally repealed in 1863, though in truth, it had died long before. Industrialization had transformed baking. Steam ovens, mechanical kneaders, and standardized flour mills made bread faster, cheaper, and more uniform. The old system of local weighers and inspectors was obsolete. No one was paraded for a light loaf anymore. No one hung bread around their neck in shame. The baker had become a businessman. But with freedom came new dangerous adulteration, deceit, and the loss of trust. Bread in the age of chemistry, without the strict rules of the assize, some bakers began cutting corners again. This time not by shaving ounces, but by altering ingredients. In the 18th and 19th centuries, London's streets were filled with cheap, pale loaves that owed their whiteness not to fine wheat, but to alum chalk. Adulteration, reformers called it. Poison, others said. The poor, who had once trusted the assize to protect them, now found themselves eating bread that looked perfect but was harmful. In 1757, a wave of public anger swept through England when it was discovered that some bakers used plaster of Paris to whiten their loaves. Parliament responded, not by reviving the assize, but by passing new laws on purity and labelling. The error of moral weighing had given way to the error of scientific inspection. The principle was the same: the people's food must be safe, but the means had changed forever. The ghost of the pillory, even after the assize was gone, its shadow lingered in memory. For centuries, English folk sayings had preserved its imagery. A light loaf makes a heavy punishment. As honest as a baker's dozen, the pillory waits for the thin loaf. In some towns, the pillory itself remained standing long after it ceased to be used. A wooden ghost of civic justice. Children played on it, unaware that it had once been a place of terror for bakers. In a curious way, these memories humanized the assize. What had once been a system of fear became, in retrospect, a story of fairness, a quaint symbol of the old days, when everyone was held to account, even the man who sold your bread. But behind the nostalgia lay centuries of exhaustion and struggle. The French Revolution and the price of bread. If England quietly buried its bread law, France's was torn apart in revolution. By 1789, the average Parisian spent half their income on bread. When harvests failed and prices rose, anger turned to violence. Crowds stormed bakeries shouting, "Du pain! Du pain!" Bread. The revolution began in many ways with a loaf. Queen Marie Antoinette never actually said, let them eat cake. But the myth persisted because it captured a truth: bread was the measure of justice. When it failed, the whole structure of authority collapsed. After the revolution, French governments repeatedly tried to fix bread prices, but none succeeded for long. The market had grown too vast, the world too unpredictable. The medieval dream of the perfectly fair loaf was over. The baker's legacy, what then, remains of those centuries of weighing, measuring, and punishing. The assize of bread may be gone, but its influence endures in ways you might not expect. Modern food labeling, weight standards, and consumer protection laws all trace a faint lineage back to those medieval scales. The idea that food should be honest, that the poor deserve fairness in what they eat. These are echoes of the same principle that once governed the baker's oven. Even the humble baker's dozen still carries that old spirit of caution and kindness, a reminder that generosity began, oddly enough, as a defense against fear. Bread and memory. There is something almost poetic about how bread, more than any other food, reflects the societies that bake it. In medieval towns, it was a symbol of divine order. In Renaissance cities, it became a sign of wealth. In revolutions, it turned into a cry for freedom. Through all those changes, the baker remained, an ordinary craftsman standing between hunger and hope. The law judged his work by weight and measure, but the people judged it by taste and trust. And in that simple transaction, one loaf for one coin, lay centuries of history. Today, when you slice a piece of bread, you are handling something that once could have sent a man to prison. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most regulated, feared, and revered foods ever made. The last loaf. Imagine a small English town in the 1860s, on the day the old assize is repealed. An elderly baker, his hands thick with flour, stands by his oven and reads the notice aloud. The law that has ruled his life for 40 years is gone. No more scales, no more weighers, no more pillory. He looks at his loaves cooling on the table, golden, fragrant, perfect by habit, not by force. And for the first time in history, he can bake by choice. The bell in the church tower rings the hour, as it always has. The market stirs, children run past the door. The world has not changed in appearance, but the weight of every loaf has shifted, ever so slightly, from obligation to freedom. Bread has always been more than sustenance. It is the quiet bond between ruler and ruled, between trust and hunger. And though the assize of bread has long since faded, its spirit lingers every time a baker, anywhere in the world, checks a loaf and thinks, is it fair? In the medieval world, the law did not end at the edge of the human race. It reached into the barnyard, the forest, and even the river. Pigs, cows, rats, and horses could be, and often were, put on trial. Yes, real trials, with judges, clerks, witnesses, and sometimes even lawyers. A murderer might stand accused beside a sow, a thief beside a goat, a vandal beside a swarm of locusts. The logic, though strange to us, was clear to them. If a creature could cause harm, then it could also be judged. The first accused a pig in Falaise. It was the year 1386, in the Norman town of Falaise, France. The story goes that a pig, a common sow, had wandered into the street and attacked a small child, fatally wounding him. The people were horrified. A child dead, a creature guilty. Something had to be done. The authorities moved quickly. The sow was arrested, yes, formally arrested, and placed in the town's jail. A trial was arranged. A judge was appointed. Witnesses were called. And the pig was brought before the court wearing human clothes, a jacket and breeches, to symbolize her place in the world she had violated. The verdict was inevitable. The sow was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. On the appointed day, she was led to the gallows, accompanied by the executioner and a crowd of solemn citizens. The sentence was carried out with all the seriousness of human justice. To us it sounds absurd, but to them, it was a necessary act of order, the law behind the madness. To understand why such trials took place, you have to step into the medieval mind, a world where law was not just about punishment, but about balance. Every act of violence, whether human or animal, was believed to disturb the divine harmony of creation. Justice was not simply retribution, it was purification. If a pig killed a child, the act had to be cleansed through legal ritual. Otherwise, the land itself might suffer. Crops might fail, illness might spread, misfortune might follow. The church called this interdicta animalium, the interdiction of animals, a process both judicial and spiritual. Secular and ecclesiastical courts, there were two kinds of animal trials in the Middle Ages: secular trials, for domestic animals like pigs, cows, or horses that injured humans; ecclesiastical trials, for wild or pest species like locusts or rats accused of destroying crops or spreading disease. In secular cases, the process mirrored human law almost exactly. The animal would be arrested, charged, tried, and executed, often publicly. In ecclesiastical cases, the tone was different. The church would summon the creatures to appear before a priest. If they failed to appear, as they usually did, the priest would excommunicate them, banishing them from the community or invoking divine wrath upon them. One famous example comes from 1510, when the people of Autun, France, brought legal action against a group of rats accused of consuming the town's barley crop. A defense lawyer was actually appointed, one Bartholomew Chasseniox, a young and talented jurist. He argued, quite reasonably, that his clients had not appeared in court because the roads were unsafe for small creatures, being filled with cats. The court granted a continuance. Such was the sincerity with which these proceedings were conducted. The pig as scapegoat pigs were the most common defendants in medieval Europe. Why pigs? Because they lived close to humans, roaming freely through towns, rooting in refuse and feeding near children. They were both useful and dangerous. A sow that attacked a child became not just a criminal, but a symbol of moral failure, a sign that sin and disorder had entered the heart of the community. By punishing the animal, the people were, in a sense, punishing the chaos within themselves. Sometimes, if the pig belonged to a peasant, the owner might escape punishment, but often both owner and animal suffered consequences. The execution of the pig served as both justice and warning. In a few cases, pigs were granted clemency if they had acted under provocation, an early form of recognizing self-defense. But mercy was rare. When the church spoke to the insects, ecclesiastical trials took on a stranger tone still. In 1478, in the Swiss canton of Bern, a swarm of beetles was accused of destroying the vineyards. The court ordered them to appear at a certain date. When they did not, they were solemnly excommunicated. In 1519, in the Diocese of Lausanne, field mice were tried for damaging crops. The mice were given an attorney, who argued that the accused were God's creatures, and had as much right to live as men did. He also requested that they be granted alternative lands where they could live without causing harm. The judge, in a remarkable ruling, agreed, ordering the villagers to set aside a small meadow for the mice. These absurd-sounding rituals were performed with complete seriousness. They reflected a worldview in which law, religion, and nature were deeply intertwined. The people were not mocking justice. They were defending the boundaries of their world. The symbolic weight of the trials to a modern mind. An animal trial seems meaningless, but in the medieval imagination it was a kind of exorcism, a way to remove guilt from a community and restore divine order. Animals were part of a moral universe. They were not innocent by nature. They could act under demonic influence or out of alignment with divine law. To judge them was to reaffirm that law ruled over all creation. It was also a powerful performance, a public drama in which people could witness the restoration of justice. The sight of a pig being hanged, terrible as it was, reminded everyone that the world was governed by rules that transcended them. The executioner's duty. Executioners, too, took their role seriously. In some French towns, records show that they were paid extra to carry out animal executions, sometimes receiving gloves or new clothes to mark the solemnity of the task. The animal's body was often left hanging for a day or more, a grim warning to others. In certain cases, the carcass was buried outside the town limits to prevent spiritual contagion. Every step was ritualized, from the trial to the gallows to the burial. Each part reaffirmed the moral and cosmic order. The legal mindset. By the late 1400s, the practice of animal trials had spread widely across Europe, France, Switzerland, Germany, and even Italy. Legal scholars debated their meaning. Some argued that animals could not truly possess intent, and thus could not be guilty. Others countered that since animals could obey or disobey commands, they were capable of moral failure. Theologians went further. If animals were part of God's creation, they too fell under his laws. In this view, justice was not merely human, it was universal. Even today, in dusty archives, you can find pages of medieval court records filled with phrases like, "The so aforesaid did feloniously attack the child," or, "The said rats did wickedly consume the barley," to the clerks who wrote them. These were not jokes, they were acts of cosmic maintenance. Beyond the barnyard, animal trials were not confined to Europe alone. In parts of medieval Persia, elephants and camels could be ceremonially punished for harming humans. In India, certain Hindu legal traditions allowed animals to be banished from a village if they had caused death. Even in early colonial America, echoes of these practices appeared, though usually in the form of compensation rather than punishment. Humanity's need to impose moral order on nature seems to transcend time and place. A mirror of humanity, perhaps the most revealing aspect of these trials is what they say about people, not animals. By treating beasts as moral agents, medieval society projected its own conscience outward. The animals became mirrors, reflecting human guilt, fear, and desire for control. A pig that killed a child was not just a beast, it was the embodiment of chaos. A swarm of locusts was not just a natural disaster, it was divine punishment. And so, by putting them on trial, people could reassure themselves that justice still ruled the world, even when it clearly didn't. As the centuries turned, these trials would grow more elaborate, more symbolic, and sometimes more tragic. They would test the limits of reason and faith, law and superstition. And one day, a single cow, a seemingly ordinary animal, would spark a dispute so strange and so bitter that it would lead to the rewriting of laws themselves. But that is a story for the next section. In the year 1474, in the Swiss city of Basel, something remarkable, and to modern minds almost unbelievable, took place. A rooster was put on trial for laying an egg. The charge, a crime against nature. The verdict, guilty. The punishment, death by burning. The people of Basel had long been known for their adherence to law and order. But to understand why they would condemn a rooster, or why just a few years later a cow would nearly plunge their region into war, we must look deeper, beyond absurdity, into the medieval mind's relationship with justice, ownership, and the animal world. The rooster's egg, it began when townsfolk claimed to have discovered an egg in a rooster's nest. The very idea was alarming. According to medieval superstition, a rooster's egg, small, round and without a yolk, could hatch into a serpent or even a basilisk, the legendary creature whose gaze could kill. The townspeople, fearing evil, brought the case to court. A tribunal was convened. Witnesses testified that the bird had indeed laid the egg. Learned men were consulted, priests, magistrates, and natural philosophers. After due deliberation, the court declared the rooster guilty of an unnatural act, the work of the devil himself. And so, in the public square, the bird was burned, not for its deed, but for what it represented. The rooster's trial in Basel became infamous, not only because of its absurdity, but because it revealed something fundamental about the medieval concept of law. Everything that happened in creation had meaning. Even the smallest creature could become a vessel of cosmic disorder. And soon, in that same region, another creature, this time a cow, would be accused of starting a conflict that tested the very fabric of medieval justice. The cow of the Canton border. The story begins near the Swiss borderlands between the small communities of Seignelliger and Le Chaux-de-Fonds, sometime in the late 1400s. The details are hazy, blurred by time, but the record preserved in local chronicles tells of a dispute between two cantons, each claiming ownership of a cow. The cow, a placid brown heifer, had wandered across a border stream, grazing peacefully on the wrong side. When the owner from one canton found her, he called her back home, but a shepherd from the neighboring canton claimed that the animal belonged to his master. The argument escalated. Words became blows. By evening, one of the men lay dead. The surviving villagers seized the cow as evidence. And suddenly, this single, bewildered animal became the centerpiece of a legal and political dispute that drew in two entire territories. Each side demanded justice. Each claimed the other's man had struck first, and each insisted that the cow was rightfully theirs. The question that began as "who owns this cow?" soon became "who owns this land?" From trial to conflict, the dispute was formally presented to the regional court. In the late medieval Swiss Confederation, such matters were of enormous significance, not only for property rights, but for political authority. To possess a pasture was to possess the livelihood of an entire community. The court ordered that both sides present their evidence. Witnesses were called, oaths were sworn, and the cow herself was brought before the tribunal. A living, glowing symbol of the case. No one, of course, expected her to testify, but her presence mattered. The act of placing her before the court was ceremonial, a reminder that even the creatures of the field fell under human justice. As arguments unfolded, tempers flared. The cow was placed temporarily under the protection of the court to prevent either side from seizing her. But one night, under cover of darkness, she disappeared. When the loss was discovered, both cantons accused each other of theft. A simple trial became a feud became a standoff, and soon, a handful of armed men from each side gathered in the disputed valley, shouting insults across the border. Shots were fired. The chronicles describe it as a minor war, though it resulted in at least a dozen deaths, all sparked by one cow, one pasture, and one legal misunderstanding. The the laws reached to us, this story might seem like farce. Yet for those who lived through it, it was deadly serious. In the medieval imagination, animals were not just property. They were part of the social order. To steal, kill, or even mismanage one was to disturb the balance between humans and nature. The cow of the pasture was a sign of wealth, honor, and divine blessing. To lose one through negligence or theft was a shame. To lose one through injustice was intolerable. Law in that world was not a distant abstraction. It was the framework that held the community and the cosmos together.